So when we look at total manufacturing cost variance, we're going to look at it in direct material, direct labor, and factory overhead. And for direct materials, we're going to break that down into direct materials price and direct materials quantity variance. For direct labor, it is the same thing, but instead of calling it price, we're going to call it rate because we pay somebody, for example, $18 an hour, so it's a rate. Notice that this really is also a dollar, so you could think of it as price so that it looks just like this one above it, but we are going to call it a rate variance. Then direct labor time variance is really the same thing as quantity. It's just how many hours somebody works, so we call it time instead of quantity. But these two, direct material and direct labor, are actually the same thing. Again, we call it direct materials price variance and direct labor rate variance. So those are the same. And then for the quantity part, we call it direct materials quantity variance. But for direct labor, we call it time because they're in hours. Now let's talk about factory overhead. We're going to break it into controllable variance and the volume variance, controllable variance and the volume variance. Again, that's because factory overhead has two components, part fixed and part variable. This slide's just a summary of how we're going to break down the variances into direct material and direct labor, so you may want to take notes of this slide. So for Western Writer, we have a direct materials cost variance of $26.50, and the actual cost is actual price times actual quantity, and the standard cost is made up of standard price times standard quantity. So that gets us to our total materials cost variance. We need to break that down though into quantity and price. Before we break that down, here's the slide where it's showing what I just mentioned earlier. Actual direct material cost is your actual price times your actual quantity. That's how you get the $41.50. And then the standard cost is the standard price times the standard quantity, and that's the $37.5. So let's break down the price part. Here's the formula to break down our price. It's the actual price minus the standard price. This makes sense because we want to know actual minus standard to get our price difference. Then we're going to times it by the actual quantity. Then if it's favorable, we'll call it a favorable variance, and if it's unfavorable, we'll call it an unfavorable variance. So actual price minus the standard price, so the $5.50 minus $5, so we see that we have 50 cents higher than we were planning, times the actual quantity. So we have a direct materials price variance of $36.50. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing for the direct materials quantity variance. It's going to be the actual quantity minus the standard quantity times the standard price. So remember, in price variance, we did actual price minus standard price, and then we multiplied by actual for actual quantity. So for this one, the quantity variance, we did actual quantity minus standard quantity, but this time we times it by standard price. So you want to write those down and compare the two, and you want to keep them straight in your head. Mainly what you're multiplying it by, because it can be confusing at first, but after a while, they're going to become second nature. So when you look and see if this is favorable or unfavorable, let's plug it in so we can see. So the quantity variance, we're going to take actual minus standard. And so the actual quantity was 7,300 square yards. The standard quantity was 7,500 square yards. We're going to multiply that times the standard price. So we actually had a quantity variance that was favorable in this situation by $1,000. So if we want to, we can look at the price variance netted with the quantity variance, and that would equal our total variance. And here's a wonderful graphic of how it works. So on our first slide, we knew that our total direct materials cost variance was equal to $26.50. We just broke down our two variances into a price variance of $36.50 and a quantity variance of $1,000. What this will tell managers is we paid a lot more price, but we actually used less quantity. So if we wouldn't have used less quantity, then our overall variance would have been even worse. So this is a total variance broken down into the price variance and the quantity variance. Okay, so let's work this example exercise. So it gives us some information, and I will tell you that one of the hardest parts is going through the information and figuring out what we need. And one of the easier parts is to put it into our equations and figure out our price variance, our quantity variance, and our total direct material cost variance, which is just A and B netted together. So I'm going to show you how to think about it, and then I'm going to also show you down here the slide that came with it with our answers, and you can decide which way makes more sense for you to use. So I like to make a chart like this and fill in my information, and then I can plug it into my formula. So it says we require 6 standard pounds per unit. The standard price is $4.50 per pound. So that is easy to put in using standard price. I'm going to put in $4.50 here. And then it says that if 3,000 units require 18,500 pounds, which were purchased at $4.35 per pound, what is these variances? So the actual that we purchased them for is $4.35. So that is our actual price. So I'm going to put $4.35 here. So now I'm able to get my difference, and I can see that I actually paid less than what I expected. So this is actually a favorable variance. So I am going to put, let me fix this. So I'm going to put favorable. So I need to do, let me fix that. I'm going to do actual minus the standard, and that would be a favorable difference. Now I need to look at my quantity. So in this quantity, I'm told that I normally need 6 pounds per unit, and we want to know that pounds times actual that we produced. So we will say standard is the 6 times what we actually produced. And it says that we actually produced 3,000. And I am not able to type well today. So 18,000. And again, that is because it required 6 standard units per 6 standard pounds per unit. And that is because how much did we actually make, or how much was actually required? 3,000. And then it tells me that when I made it, I actually used 18,500. So that was my actual. So in this situation, I used more than I expected. So this would be an unfavorable variance. So now let's just do our formula. So our formula for price variance, we're doing a price variance. So the first part is standard price minus the actual price. And the thing you multiply it for, if you're doing price, you're going to multiply it by the quantity variance. So this multiply the quantity, and for this is actual quantity. So for price variance, you're going to multiply it by the quantity. I always remember that it's actual quantity and not standard. It's actual in the first one because actual starts with an A. And I always do my price variance first. So price variance is always multiplied by actual quantity. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our formula for quantity. While we're looking at it, we're doing quantity. So it's going to be standard quantity minus actual quantity. And since we're doing the quantity variance, we're going to multiply it times the price. And we've already used actual. So since we're doing a quantity variance, we're going to multiply it by the price, and we've already used actual quantity. So this is going to be standard price. So here's how I memorize this. I just know if I do a price variance, that of course the parentheses will be my price. Then I always multiply it by the opposite of what it is. It's a price variance, so it's the quantity. And the price variance will always have actual because we do price first and actual is an A, and A is first in the alphabet. When I'm doing my quantity variance, in the parentheses, I've got my quantity, and then I multiply it by the opposite, which is price. And since in the first one I used actual, this time I'm going to use standard. That's how I memorize it, but you can memorize it however makes sense to you. Okay, so let's plug this in. Standard price is going to be $4.50 minus the actual, which is $4.35, times the actual quantity, which is 18,500. So that is going to be our difference is 0.15, and then times our actual would be -2775, and that is favorable. So let's find out why that is favorable. Well, it's because I spent 435. I thought I was going to spend 450